Asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction does not involve sex cells or fertilization. Only one parent is required, so there is no fusion of gametes and no mixing of genetic information. As a result, the offspring are genetically identical to the parent and to each other clones. Asexual reproduction is defined as a process resulting in genetically identical offspring from one parent. Examples of asexual reproduction. Bacteria produce exact genetic copies of themselves in a type of asexual reproduction called binary fission. Bacteria produce exact genetic copies of themselves in a type of asexual reproduction called binary fission. Plants can reproduce asexually using bulbs and tubers. These are food storage organs from which budding can occur, producing new plants which are genetically identical to the parent plant. Some plants develop underground food storage organs that will develop into next year's plants. They can take different forms, such as bulbs or tubers. Some plants grow side shoots called runners that contain tiny plantlets on them. A good example of this are strawberry plants. These will grow roots and develop into separate plants, again being genetically identical to the parent plant. Some plants grow side shoots called runners that contain tiny plantlets on them. These will grow roots and develop into separate plants. Advantages and disadvantages of asexual reproduction, extended. Specifically in crop plants, asexual reproduction can be advantageous as it means that a plant that has good characteristics, high yield, disease resistant, hardy, can be made to reproduce asexually and the entire crop will show the same characteristics. 16. Two gametes and zygotes. Sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is a process involving the fusion of the nuclei of two gametes, sex cells, to form a zygote fertilized egg cell, and the production of offspring that are genetically different from each other. Fertilization is defined as the fusion of gamete nuclei, and as each gamete comes from a different parent, there is variation in the offspring. Gametes. A gamete is a sex cell, in animals, sperm and ovum, in plants pollen nucleus and ovum. Gametes differ from normal cells as they contain half the number of chromosomes found in other body cells. We say they have a haploid nucleus. This is because they only contain one copy of each chromosome, rather than the two copies found in other body cells. In human beings, a normal body cell contains 46 chromosomes, but each gamete contains 23 chromosomes. When the male and female gametes fuse, they become a zygote fertilized egg cell. This contains the full 46 chromosomes, half of which came from the father and half from the mother. We say the zygote has a diploid nucleus. Haploid and diploid cells, extended. The nuclei of gametes are haploid. They contain half the number of chromosomes of a normal body cell. In humans, this is 23 chromosomes. The nucleus of a zygote is diploid. It contains the same number of chromosomes as a normal body cell. In humans, this is 23 pairs of chromosomes. The zygote continues to stay diploid as it grows into a fetus and embryo during pregnancy. Advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction, extended. Most crop plants reproduce sexually, and this is an advantage as it means variation is increased and a genetic variant may be produced which is better able to cope with weather changes, or produces significantly higher yield. The disadvantage is that the variation may lead to offspring that are less successful than the parent plant at growing well or producing a good harvest. Insect-pollinated flowers. Flowers are the reproductive organ of the plant. They usually contain both male and female reproductive parts. Plants produce pollen which contains a nucleus inside that is the male gamete. Unlike the male gamete in humans, sperm pollen is not capable of locomotion, moving from one place to another. This means plants have to have mechanisms in place to transfer pollen from the anther to the stigma. This process is known as pollination, and there are two main mechanisms by which it occurs: transferred by insects, or other animals like birds, or transferred by wind. The structure of insect and wind-pollinated flowers are slightly different as each is adapted for their specific function. Parts of the flower. General flower structure. Structure of a flower. Features of an insect-pollinated flower. Did this video help you? Yes. No. Wind-pollinated flowers. Features of a wind-pollinated flower. The pollen produced by insect and wind-pollinated flowers is also different. Insect-pollinated flowers produce smaller amounts of larger, heavier pollen grains that often contain spikes or hooks on the outside, so they are better able to stick to insects. Wind-pollinated flowers produce large amounts of small, lightweight pollen grains that are usually smooth. Here is an example of a multiple-choice question asking students to use their knowledge to identify types of pollen grain. A multiple choice question asking students to use their knowledge to identify types of pollen grain. Did this video help you? Yes. No. Pollination and fertilization. Pollination. Pollination is discussed above as the ways in which pollen grains can be transferred from an anther to a stigma. Fertilization. Fertilization occurs when a pollen nucleus fuses with an ovum nucleus in the ovule. As the pollen has no tail to swim to the ovary of a plant, in order to reach the female nucleus in the ovary, it has to grow a pollen tube. This only happens if the pollen grain has landed on the right kind of stigma, i.e., of the same species as the flower the pollen came from. The nucleus inside the pollen grain slips down the tube as it grows down the style towards the ovary. The ovary contains one or more ovules which each contain an ovum with a female nucleus that a male pollen nucleus can fuse with. Once the nuclei have joined together, that ovule has been fertilized and a zygote has been formed. The zygote will start to divide and eventually form a seed within the ovule. As different plants have different numbers of ovules, this explains why different fruits which develop from the ovary have different numbers of seeds which develop from the ovules. Growth of a pollen tube. Fertilization in a flowering plant. Exam tip. Students often get confused between pollination and fertilization in plants, but they are not the same thing. Think of pollination as the plant's equivalent to human sexual intercourse. After sex, the male sex cell's sperm have been deposited into the female. But, for fertilization to occur, the nucleus from a male sperm cell has to fuse with the nucleus of a female sex cell, egg, and the sperm has to travel to find the egg before this happens. It's exactly the same in plants. Did this video help you? Yes. No. Factors affecting germination of seeds. Germination is the start of growth in the seed. 3 factors are required for successful germination. Water allows the seed to swell up and the enzymes in the embryo to start working so that growth can occur. Oxygen, so that energy can be released for germination. Warmth. Germination improves as temperature rises up to a maximum, as the reactions which take place are controlled by enzymes. As carbon dioxide is not necessary for germination but also does not inhibit it, it makes no difference whether it is present or not. Investigating germination. Set up 4 boiling tubes each containing 10 cress seeds on cotton wool. Set each test tube as shown in diagram below. Leave tubes in set environment for a period of time, A, B and C incubated at 20 degrees Celsius, D placed in a fridge at 4 degrees Celsius. Compare results and see which tube has the greatest number of germinated seeds. Conditions required for germination. Conditions required for germination. Results. Self and cross-pollination, extended. Self and cross-pollination, extended. Cross-pollination occurs when the pollen from one plant is transferred to the stigma of another plant of the same species. This is the way most plants carry out pollination, as it improves genetic variation. Occasionally, the pollen from a flower can land on its own stigma or on the stigma of another flower on the same plant. This is known as self-pollination. Self-pollination reduces genetic variety of the offspring, as all the gametes come from the same parent, and are therefore genetically identical. Lack of variation in the offspring is a disadvantage if environmental conditions change, as it is less likely that any offspring will have adaptations that suit the new conditions well. On the other hand, cross-pollination relies completely on the presence of pollinators, and this can be a problem if those pollinators are missing, e.g. the reduction in bee numbers is of great importance to humans as bees pollinate a large number of food crops. This doesn't apply to wind-pollinated plants. Growth of the pollen tube and its entry into the ovule followed by fertilization. The male reproduction system. The male reproductive system. Male reproductive structures and their function. Did this video help you? Yes. No. The female reproduction system. The female reproductive system. Female reproductive structures and their function. Did this video help you? Yes. No. Gametes and fertilization. Fertilization is the fusion of the nuclei from a male gamete, sperm cell, and a female gamete, egg cell. It occurs in the oviducts. Gametes have adaptations to increase the chances of fertilization and successful development of an embryo. Comparing sperm and egg cells. Adaptations of gametes. Comparison of male and female gametes. Did this video help you? Yes. No. Pregnancy. Growth and development of the fetus. After fertilization in the oviduct, the zygote travels towards the uterus. This takes about 3 days, during which time the zygote will divide several times to form a ball of cells known as an embryo. In the uterus, the embryo embeds itself in the thick lining implantation and continues to grow and develop. The gestation period for humans is 9 months. Major development of organs takes place within the first 12 weeks, during which time the embryo gets nutrients from the mother by diffusion through the uterus lining. After this point, the organs are all in place, the placenta has formed, and the embryo is now called a fetus. The remaining gestation time is used by the fetus to grow bigger in size. The fetus in the uterus. The fetus is surrounded by an amniotic sac which contains amniotic fluid made from the mother's blood plasma. This protects the fetus during development by cushioning it from bumps to the mother's abdomen. The umbilical cord joins the fetus's blood supply to the placenta for exchange of nutrients and removal of waste products. The placenta and umbilical cord, extended. During the gestation period, the fetus develops and grows by gaining the glucose, amino acids, fats, water, and oxygen it needs from the mother's blood. The bloods run opposite each other, never mixing, in the placenta. The fetus's blood connects to and from the placenta by the umbilical cord. The mother's blood also absorbs the waste from the fetus's blood in the placenta. Substances like carbon dioxide and urea are removed from the fetus's blood so that they do not build up to dangerous levels. Movement of all molecules across the placenta occurs by diffusion due to difference in concentration gradients. The placenta is adapted for this diffusion by having a large surface area and a thin wall for efficient diffusion. The placenta acts as a barrier to prevent toxins and pathogens getting into the fetus's blood. Not all toxin molecules or pathogenic organisms, such as viruses, e.g. rubella, are stopped from passing through the placenta. This usually depends on the size of the molecule. This is why pregnant women are advised not to smoke during pregnancy, as molecules like nicotine can pass across the placenta. After the baby has been born, the umbilical cord is cut. This does not hurt as there are no nerves in it, just 2 blood vessels. It is tied off to prevent bleeding and shrivels up and falls off after a few days, leaving the belly button behind. The placenta detaches from the uterus wall shortly after birth and is pushed out due to contractions in the muscular wall of the uterus, known as the afterbirth. The placenta. Exam tip. It is worth learning at least 2 specific substances that move in either direction across the placenta. This is a common exam question, and non-specific answers such as waste products and nutrients will not get any marks.